Afternoon. Good afternoon. Good night. All right, so welcome to this live. The focus of this live is basically to engage you in a form of bringing to your foremind um, some of the considerations you should put into place as regards to um, basically building, or as it stands right about us as a country rebuilding. Link invalid. So for this live, the plan is basically to engage sharing geography as well as geology related insight. That's key to understanding the factors you should take into consideration as regards to building in a flood safe area. Let me see if I can bring on Eyanie here. Eyanie, are you here?
Yes, I
Can you hear me?
can hear you.
And you can hear me too?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. All right, good. I back feed on your side, because if you can turn down the audio on your side.
Okay. You're still hearing that back?
Check.
Hello?
No, not hearing about fee anymore.
Okay, great.
Well, yeah, if needs be, do you have a headphone?
No, I don't have one on this with my lock. I don't have one for my phone.
All right, let me see if I can do something here. All right, so I guess what I'm gonna ask you to do is, you see, when I'm speaking, just kindly mute your mic, and then when it's your turn to speak, I will then mute mine. Right. Okay, so let's get ready to get started now. So yeah, man, this is now us coming live. Myself, Oshane Bryant, and Eyanie Bennett, who is a geographer with a statistics focus as well. And the whole aim of this live is basically to present to the layman some basics as regards to taking into consideration geofactors in the context of building and or rebuilding in flood safe areas. And our focus for this evening is basically the parish of Manchester. So the reason why we have now started with Manchester instead of, say, for example, St. Elizabeth and Westmoreland is because of the reality that, at least over the past couple of weeks since Hurricane Melissa, uh, the reality of flooding would have been more so widespread in terms of media coverage for the content era in Manchester. And this basically sheds the light that in the scheme of understanding flooding, it's not just about flash flooding or urban flooding or even coastal flooding that can arise as a result of, so for example, storm surges, but it's also in the context of groundwater flooding that the WRA head would have brought to the attention of the public. So where we're going to be taking this discussion is around, first of all, giving a general synopsis of Manchester as a parish in Jamaica. The overall landscape, the history, if you will, as it pertains to the economic life of Manchester, and in some respect, why it's a case that we are actually looking into Manchester separate and apart from the geography, geology, but even from an angle of its economic value, or indicators that is of significance for Jamaica's development. So that is where Eyanie will lead. and then I will go a bit into the geology, as well as basically bringing to your attention the whole context of contours and rule of V, etc. So I'm gonna allow Ian to start and shape the discussion around the geography, around the economy, around the population dynamics of Manchester, and then I can take it on from there. Ian, your turn.
Good night, everyone. As stated before, I will just be discussing, giving you guys a brief synopsis of the background of like Manchester and content itself. So, before I speak on content and Hurricane Melissa, it is important to understand the background of the parish in Manchester. So, Manchester is one of Jamaica's south central parishes, and it is known for its cool, elevated terrain, steep hills, urban communities as well. You know that its capital is Mandeville, and it sits more than 2,000 feet above sea level, making it one of the highest major towns in the Caribbean. So let's go into specifically that is content. So you know that content is a rural community that is located in Manchester. It is surrounded by parishes such as, not parishes, communities such as Newport, Williamsfield, and it is located on the outskirts of Mandeville, and also another community is Porus. So, what makes content a noteworthy, as stated before by Mr. Bryant, is the rising underground sea levels. So, a little bit more background on Manchester itself. It is known for its agricultural background and also bauxite. The parish produces yam, scallion, pepper, coffee, small livestock, and one of its iconic crops, the organic orange. It is a very unique fruit, and is natural hybrid of a sweet orange and tangerine. It was first developed right in Manchester in the early 1900s. So it is a symbol of the parish's identity and a reminder of how deeply connected the people are to the land. So, also, Manchester has a mix of small businesses, transportation services, remittance based households, and public sector workers. These sectors are sensitive to disruptions because many households operate on a tight budget with little room for long interruptions. So, that is just one, a little background. Also, coming from a humanitarian concern, specifically with Hurricane Melissa. We all know that Jamaica is a aging population, specifically because of the birth rates, and because of this natural hazard that took place, it leaves a lot of persons vulnerable. And this is now where Mr. Bryant will take over to give you guys a tad bit more information as to why that makes persons in the parish a little bit more vulnerable.
All right. So as Ian touched on the whole context of aging population, the thing that we need to take into consideration is that as we age, or let's just say we move past our prime in our years, we basically will naturally decline in our muscle mass, will naturally decline in basically the hormones that help us to be able to be in a prime functional state. So, in essence, when we decline in muscle mass, it means therefore that our risk of falling increases. It means that our productivity overall will pretty much decline. It also is a case that as we move beyond, say for example, our prime years, then we're talking about the fact that we have metabolic issues that can arise. We're talking about the reality that blood sugar issues can become a major factor for us. Blood pressure issues can become a major factor for us. And so, in essence, when now we are faced with the reality that we have a natural occurrence in the event of a storm or any other form of shock, it basically can place these members of the aging population in a much more vulnerable position in the state that there is a heightened degree of stress. And this heightened degree of stress basically can also place them in a situation where they can experience a degree of an acute shock response. In other words, we're talking about, stroke, or we may talk about it being a case that people may have a degree of a respiratory issue, etc. The in essence now, as a population age, and yet still it's a case that we're talking about the fact that the risk profile surrounding storm events, as an example, goes up based on frequency, as an example, then this would place an increased strain on the government body, if you will, to try and assist the population in, let's just say, moving into shelters. And basically, it's in that sense that, as we age, it becomes much more harder for us as a country to be able to be in a state of readiness to get the most vulnerable out of the more vulnerable areas. Um, this is why, say for example, our relative parish of Manchester is of focus, because Manchester is somewhat in the center of where Jamaica is trying to develop the southern parishes, if you will, or the southwestern parishes, if you will. So you think of it like as the bridge between the bread basket, St. Elizabeth, and Kingston and St. Andrew. And the highway now being extended to Manchester, or sections of Manchester. Basically, we're talking about the reality that we may have a hastened degree of transport, or commerce, or basically commute. And as such, we're talking about increased development. So in essence, we should expect that, where it comes to this linkage in the form of the highway, you can have a greater degree of migration, rural to urban, urban to rural. And in essence, it then now means that Manchester can also be somewhat pivotal in the sense where you can have a degree of population growth as well. Now, this population growth, as said, could be as a result that you have the influx of the younger population coming from Kingston St. Andrew as examples. Now, if it's a case that we're talking about Manchester's inherent population basically being aging, or being in a state of aging as an example, then it means therefore that from a planning point of view, we have to make sure that the disaster management framework takes into consideration where the population is located within the parish, and basically put the necessary measures in place so that, where it comes to response can be adequate. So that is why, aging, or having an aging population, and knowing where the aging population is located geographically, is very important where it comes to disaster management or disaster response in that respect. Now, where I want to take it is in the context of the flooding from an angle of the physical geography. So to bring it into your mind, as Eyanie mentioned a while ago, Manchester basically is, a parish that is somewhat of a plateau, right? Without trying to make it too overcomplicated for you, there exists the reality that Manchester is dominated by carbonate or limestone, if you want to put it like that, just from a simplistic point of view. But there does exist also a many degree of karst areas within Manchester. So in that respect, much of the water systems or the river systems of Manchester flows underground. And because of the fact now that we're talking about the reality that there exists also the seismic or the tectonic control in the form of earthquakes or fault zones, it means therefore that where the water will flow is not uniform. It means therefore that when you think about the general landscape of Manchester, or where certain areas of Manchester will flood inland, that is, we have to look at it from an angle of observing as well how the actual terrain sets itself, because that gives us geo people the cue in terms of knowing how to identify relatively flood risk areas. So based on the fact that this is a live and we pretty much just have to move on the fly, I cannot necessarily present to you, or give you that good view about the terrain. But what it is that you can do, if you do have access to it, you go on your Google map, you basically select the feature of terrain. When you select the feature of Google terrain, you can just pinpoint it over uh, Manchester Parish. And when you pinpoint over the Manchester Parish, what you should be able to see is basically, yes, green areas. You should be able to see gray areas. And you should also see some areas where you can see blue. Long story short, the blue areas, then that's the area where water is. Now, in where you may see Williamsfield, like a little bit to the northwest of Williamsfield, there is a nice little blue section there. So, and that's like a nice little bauxitic lake here. All right. And near to that bauxitic lake area, there exists the parish, or not a parish, sorry, the community of Content. Now, Content pretty much sits somewhat like it's in a basin relative to where that lake is, right? And relative to the Content area to the right, or moving to the southeast or east southeast, we also would notice that there exists like some depressions. Like I'm gonna call it depression because you suppose you can see where it's like it just dropped down, it just benched down, right? And that is where you're going into the communities of Porous, as an example. So just mentioning now what it is that, say for example, the Water Resource Authority head would have stated, which is to say that, naturally what should happen is that the water flows from high elevation to low elevation. But in the context of groundwater flow, it's going to not be as fast as surface water because of many other factors, right? In the context of where porous is, porous basically exists relatively on a lower uh, height. Yes, that's the word. A lower height relative to where content is. So because of the fact that water now when it will flow from high to low, it should actually go down to porous. But obviously we have to talk about the fact that it may be a case where there may be fault zones that can impede, or it can be a case that we may have some actual blockage in the form of solid rock strata. That means that the water will have to take its time and go around, as an example, underground. Those are some critical factors to take into your mind. But where you are concerned, it is important that can be able to, at the very basic, look at a terrain map, look where you live, and understand that if you see on the terrain map itself that there is like a little sink, Zane, so you can look on the terrain map, and if you see like some little peak, like left, right, and you there in the sink, that's the overflow. And that's what we just want to kind of keep it basic for you to understand. You understand? You should be able to look at the Google map. Google map is free. You understand me? I say it's easily, it's readily available. Look at the Google map. Look basically where you reside, especially in the context of Manchester, and where you see that there is that indentation, there is that drop. Know that that is where water is going to run. Now, yes, we can go a little bit more technical and to say that we can look at what we call the rule of V, and we can say that based on the rule of V, we can determine that additionally you can have water or you can have runoff going this kind of a direction, that kind of a direction, and as such, again, it catches into the basin. In addition to that, sinkholes. Sinkholes is basically a natural geomorphic feature of carbonate areas. So Manchester, certain areas of Manchester have sinkholes. I'm gonna basically try to teach you how a sinkhole look on the map because, to be honest, sinkholes look similar to how hills are demarcated on a map. So you need to have additional training eye to be able to identify that, right? In essence, this is just to bring to your attention to make you understand that where sinkholes exist, or if you live in a sinkhole, you have to understand that that is basically the natural point for where water will go underground. And you have to also take into consideration that where the sinkhole exists, there now exists the hazard of subsidence, or in other words, caving. See? So you must take into consideration that when we talk about flooding in carbonate areas, we have to take into consideration that it's not just superficial flooding, but it's basically the reality that because you have underground, there are also other hazards as well that you have to take into consideration, such as, caving in, subsidence. So where in Manchester basically can you say is relatively safe, flood safe areas? Well, you can look at the higher, the higher, elevation points. And just to understand, if you have your Google terrain map, then zoom in to your Google terrain, area of focus. Specifically, we're talking about Manchester here. Zoom into it, and you should be able to see like there are some fine numbers on it. Let's just say, for example, you see 100, or you see 200, or you see 300. You see those numbers represent the elevation, see, of that point above sea level. And generally speaking, if you see where it moved from 100 to 200 to 300 to 400 at a given point, it basically means that you're at the hilltop. See? And if you then move from, say, for example, 300 to 200 to 100, and you're down to which part 100 there, you're there basically at the lower elevation. So no say that is where water is going to go. It's going to go to which part you there at the lower elevation. See? So talking about Manchester, higher elevation points, just off the top of my head, we're talking about, so for example, Newport as an example, not Patrick, Newport, these points are higher relative to Mandeville. Mandeville is like the central town within the center, the heart of Manchester. See, Mandeville is basically, going to experience a degree of urban flooding because in the context of elevation, yes, you're going to have water running off from the higher elevation points, but there also exists built areas, roads, etc. So surface runoff is going to be high, and Mandeville is not, I would say, a stranger to flooding, urban flooding in that context, right? So if you reside in Mandeville, you have to know that Mandeville flooding is going to be a regular occurrence, urban flooding in that respect. See, so if you're trying to avoid that degree of a flooding risk, you have to move probably upon a higher elevation. Hence why you hear me talk about not Patrick. You hear me talk about Newport, right? But then now as you move further south from Newport, you basically then now end up back on the coastline and Alligator Pond. Sections of Alligator Pond exist in Manchester. So the sections of Alligator Pond is prone to coastal flooding. It's on the coast. It's flat, right? And similar to that, now there does exist those springs that would exit from the flanks of the hills that basically line the southern border or boundary of the hills of Manchester there. So in that respect, you're not just also take into consideration that you're going to have, coastal flooding coming from the sea, but you more than likely also have to take the consideration that you can have, in times of rainy season, even if the sea is not in swell, depending on how close you are to where those spring points are. Those spring points can also be sources whereby you can have higher levels of water at that point, relative to the coast. See? So Alligator Pond, sections of gutters there, so top hill, that the road there that is lining up the flanks of where you come from Spur Tree and you go down like into Alligator Pond. I would have mentioned Porous, I would basically would have mentioned Content. Um, and there are communities that are entering into the Content area as well. Those areas basically can experience a degree of flooding, but in the context of the length of time that those areas can experience flooding as relative to, say, for example, Content is not going to be as great in that respect because of the fact that, it may have structural factors that are, contributory, and it may be because of the fact that as well, they are not necessarily in a basin. See? So again, you want to think about areas that are relatively safe for you to build in Manchester or to have your home in Manchester that is relatively safe from flooding. You consider being at higher elevation points, right? You look at your terrain map, you basically see where, based on the terrain map, you don't live in a basin, or where you intend to live is not where you see lower levels of the elevation point relative to a hilltop. If you know that you basically are in a space where you are not in a depression, you should be relatively fine as regards experiencing a degree of that kind of flooding that Content would have experienced. And in addition to that, you just make sure that you don't necessarily exist on the coastline, because we have to recognize people who live on the coastline areas, with the fact that we're talking about what we have experienced with Melissa. It means therefore that Jamaica's risk profile for uh, strong storms may change. So it's not no longer a thing where we can say it's a 1 in a 50-year storm or a 1 in a 100-year storm. It may be a case now that it's like in a one a 20 year or one in a 15 plus year. Climate change has no, yeah, climate change with quotes because it's a ticklish situation in terms of a ticklish topic in even for amongst geopersonnel, separate and apart from the geopolitical side. Climate change is basically changing the narrative in terms of how we have to now observe and try to characterize the risk profile of a country or of sections of a country for specific hazards that are climate related and even non-climate related. So you living on coastal areas or in coastal areas, and you basically living in areas that are in a degree of depression, or even if it's a case that you basically may not live in a depression, but you live within those regions of the country that you may have volcanic zones, and you may then not experience a degree that you may have, tributary that pretty much can flood, and or it may be a case that you can have riverine flooding, rivers basically overflowing their banks, as an example, or the urban flooding. At the end of the day, the reality of natural hazards or climate shocks is everybody's business. It's your business. You understand? Do not think that this is something that should just be left in Jamaica's case to ADPEM or to WRA or to Mines and Geology or persons such as myself and Eyanie as example, or even some other professionals who you see on YouTube are your business. You have a responsibility to know where you build. You have a responsibility to make sure that you have knowledge as regards to best practice in building. Build according to the specific code. Make sure you have the right professional guidance, and you make sure that as best as is possible, you stay open to learning. That's why we have this live. You understand? So take heed. I think that's where we can leave it for here. So another day we'll touch upon other parishes, but this is like an intro. So with that being said, Ian, do you have anything else to say? And people, you guys tuning in, if you have any questions to ask a question before we drop off, please.
All I can say is that, Mr. Brian, I completely agree with you in terms of people should take heed. It is very important to know the geology on what you're building on. Once again, I reiterate to build according to the building codes. It is very important so we could lessen the vulnerability for everyone else.
All right, good. So yeah, man, I want to say people who would have, indicated that they are here on the line: Philip Martin, Aiden Carter, Sean Henry, Sasha gave Bennett. Yeah, for all you who basically gave your heel up, big up yourself. So yeah, we'll share clips of this live, and then I guess we will touch. I think we can. All right, let's decide. Should we touch on? I think we can do not Manchester, Saint Elizabeth, and Westmoreland. So considering that then the two areas there are amongst the hard hit areas in
I would also
Jamaica.
say Hanover as well. It is.
So we're gonna try. We're gonna try for the next live. We basically try to group those three and yeah, those three parishes into it. And as said, we will showcase highlights of this in shorts so that you can be able to take it in and share it up amongst your peers. So thank you very much for tuning in. Big up yourself. Until next time.